Welcome back to week 2. This week we will be covering chapters 3 and 4. So this week for the chapter readings, you'll be reading certain sections and pages out of chapter 3. So refer to the following. You may want to highlight these or mark these in your book, but you'll be reading pages 45 and 46. And then there's lots of different sections like ocean and shallow marine waters, transitional environments. And in each of these sections, you're going to be reading the intro paragraph, the geography section, and the structure section, and then you can skip the remaining sections. In the estuary section, you're going to be reading those same things, the intro, geography, and structure, but please also read human influence. And then in the lake section, you'll read the intro, geography, and structure, and please also read the oxygen section. You can skip the entire section on marine shores, and you can skip pages 72 to 75. In chapter 4, it's a little bit simpler. You'll just read pages 77 to 79, section 4.3, and then 88 to 97. Chapter 3 covers life in water. You'll be given objectives for each chapter, and the objectives are what I use to pull from for test questions. So as you're going through the lecture and you're reading, just keep an eye out for these things to help you when you get to the test to make sure that you know the answers to each of these questions here or objectives. So our objectives for chapter 3 are to explain what the hydrologic cycle is, which is just a fancy name for the water cycle, and how water moves throughout various reservoirs in the cycle. To list the water-based ecosystems such as oceans, rivers, and lakes, and describe the geography and physical conditions, physical structures of each, explain why estuaries are important and what human influences are affecting them, and contrast oligotrophic and eutrophic lake conditions. So let's go ahead and start with chapter 3. Section 3.1 is on the hydrologic or water cycle. Over 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, and oceans contain 97% of that water. The polar ice caps and glaciers contain 2%, and the remaining 1% is in freshwater in lakes, streams, and groundwater. First, let's look at the hydrologic or the water cycle. And this cycle just shows us where water is stored and how water moves from one source to another. So your main storage areas for water on Earth are the ocean. So a lot of water stored in the ocean. We have a lot of fresh water stored in groundwater, and then some fresh water stored in streams, rivers, and lakes. So what we call surface water in this diagram. And then water can move from one reservoir to another, such as from the clouds to the ocean through precipitation. Water can move from the ocean or any other surface water back up into the clouds through evaporation. Water moves across land through surface runoff. Water is given off by any kind of plants and animals. Water given off by plants we call transpiration. So plants, as they open up their pores, take in carbon dioxide, they give off water, and that water gets evaporated up in what we call transpiration. Water is consumed by and given off by living organisms. So organisms drink water and then give off water also in their urine. And then water can go through condensation, where water vapor in the air comes back into liquid form. This is a picture of the water cycle from your text, and it just shows various sources of water and how much water is in each of these sources and is given off by these sources. Turnover time is the time that's required for the entire volume of a reservoir to be renewed. So to renew the entire volume of water in the atmosphere takes 9 days. Rivers, the turnover time is 12 to 20 days, and oceans, the time is 3,100 years. This figure in your text shows circulation of ocean currents and how cool and warm currents are moved from one area to another. So, for example, as you would expect, you have really cold water down in the Antarctic region, and the Humboldt Current circulates that cold water up along the coast of South America, so making this water a little colder than it normally would be just due to the temperature in that area. You have the Gulf Stream here that brings moderate temperatures to Europe, and so you can see the flow in this diagram of these ocean currents and how it brings either cold water from towards a pole, up, or warm water down, or kind of keeps the moderate temperatures in a region. The largest source of water on Earth is in the oceans, and next in your chapter it goes through some of the different oceans and these different sources of this ocean or salt water. The Pacific is the largest ocean basin with a total of nearly 180 million kilometers squared. This list here is just a list of some of the different gulfs and seas in the Pacific Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is the second largest basin with a total of over 106 million kilometers squared. You can see some of the regions in the Atlantic Ocean. The Indian Ocean is the smallest basin with an area of just under 75 million kilometers squared. Let's look at the depths of the oceans here. So the Pacific Ocean has an average depth of 4,000 meters. The Atlantic Ocean depth of just slightly less than that, and same with the Indian Ocean. So Atlantic and Indian both around 3,900 meters is the average depth. There are some undersea trenches that are important. The Marianas Trench is 10,000 meters deep, and it would engulf Mount Everest with 2 kilometers to spare. So you get a whole different ecology in these undersea trenches and some interesting species and things going on there because of that extreme depth in the ocean. Next, let's look at the structure of the ocean, and first we have the littoral zone or the intertidal zone, and that is the region under the influence of the rise and fall of the tide. So that's this region right here where you have the low, where the water moves from high tide to low tide. And that's the littoral zone. Your neritic zone is from the coast, so from where you'd have essentially your low tide to the edge of the continental shelf, and that's just where the ocean begins to drop off there. Your oceanic zone is everything beyond the continental shelf, and then you have different regions within the ocean zone based on the depth. So you have the epipelagic here to 200 meters, the mesopelagic down to 1,000 meters, the bathypelagic from 1,000 to 4,000 meters or so. And sorry, I think I said mesopelagic is down to 1,000 meters, and then bathypelagic from 1,000 to 4,000, abyssal down below that, and hadal down in your extreme depths, so like in your deep ocean trenches. Benthic is habitat on the bottom of the ocean, so anywhere on the ocean floor you'd call benthic, and pelagic habitat is any habitat within the water region. So not necessarily dependent on depth, but dependent on whether you're living on the bottom of that shoreline, or sorry, the bottom of the ocean floor, or whether you're living out in the waters of the ocean. Benthic versus pelagic. Now, light only reaches down a certain depth in the ocean, and approximately 80% of the solar energy striking the ocean is absorbed in the first 10 meters. Very little, if any, light penetrates past 600 meters. So that leaves approximately 3,400 meters of deep black water. If you look at the average depth of like the Pacific or most of the oceans being close to 4,000 meters, about 3,400 meters in any given ocean is, on average, is deep black water, and the only light that would be there is by bioluminescence, so organisms giving off light themselves, but not from sunlight. Notice the photic zone in the diagram. This region right here is the term that refers to where the light reaches in the ocean. It's called the photic zone. In the open ocean, the salinity or amount of salt in the water varies from about 34 parts per thousand to 36.5 parts per thousand. And we have the lowest salinity near the equator. And the reason for this is that precipitation, or the rainfall coming down, is greater than the amount of water that's evaporated. And so when you have more fresh water coming in than water going out, you will get lower salinity. There's the highest salinity in the subtropics, where more water evaporates from the water than is replaced by the rainfall or precipitation. For a lot of the time that humans have been on Earth, the oceans were not an easy place to travel, and so they kind of acted as a buffer against human intrusion. Not as many human influences, just because they are span very far distances. And of course, as we know now, though, there are lots of boats and things that travel quite frequently across the ocean, dumping garbage and garbage along shorelines that gets swept in those ocean currents, leading to the great garbage patches. So some of our main threats now are dumping, so ships dumping garbage and waste into the water, and over harvesting of marine species to the point that they can't keep up their numbers with the amount that we're taking out. So this picture here shows the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and this is a region where all of the garbage from these areas here along these coastlines gets swept out through ocean currents and makes this huge garbage patch. So in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, there are over 2 million pieces of plastic per square mile of ocean. And you probably know that plastic is not biodegradable, but it is what they call photodegradable, which means sunlight can break it down into small little pieces known as microplastics. And over 90% of the plastic pollution that's out there is made up of microplastics smaller than your fingernail. And the problem with these microplastics is they can absorb highly toxic chemicals. So if there are chemicals in the ocean like DDT and PCB, they can absorb those chemicals. And the organisms that live in the ocean are unable to distinguish microplastics from food. And so many animals will starve to death because they eat all this plastic, and they only survive just long enough to contaminate the food chain. So they take in those chemicals, they eat the plastic thinking it's food, and then those chemicals get absorbed into their body, and other organisms that eat them then get those chemicals within their body. We just looked at some features of the ocean. Let's go ahead now and look at some features specific to shallow marine waters. And one thing that you can get in shallow marine waters are coral reefs. And there are 3 different types of reefs you can see in the pictures here. There are fringing reefs, and these corals grow around young islands. They hug the shores of islands and continents. As an island subsides, the corals can continue to grow upward and outward toward the sea, forming what they call a barrier reef, and this forms between the open sea and a lagoon. So you can see the picture here. If this were a lagoon right here, then that reef around that lagoon would be called a barrier reef. And then coral atolls are coral inlets built up from submerged ocean island. So as the island continues to subside, coral growth may form an atoll on top of the island when it has subsided completely below sea level. One really important ecosystem within the shallow marine waters are the kelp beds. And kelp beds have a structure similar to terrestrial forests, so forests on land, in that they have a sort of a canopy up near the top, gets more sunlight, and then shadier, cooler areas near the bottom. Reefs and kelp beds both grow in surface waters with sufficient light for photosynthesis, so they need a certain amount of light, and that's why they only grow in shallow marine waters. And they're both also limited by temperature, so they need warmer, sunnier water to grow. Currents deliver oxygen and nutrients and remove waste from these kelp forests, and biological productivity may depend on flushing action, so that you need enough current flow in the ocean to flush out the waste and bring in new nutrients. And reefs and kelp beds can be among the most productive and diverse ecosystems that we have. Now, estuaries are found where a river meets the sea. So whenever you have a river flowing down that is fresh water, and then you have the ocean where currents can flow in and out, this area in the middle where you get a mix of fresh and salt water is called an estuary. Salt marshes and mangrove forests are concentrated along low-lying coasts, and they are driven by ocean tides and river flow, and they transport organisms, nutrients, oxygen, and remove waste. And they're extremely vulnerable to human intrusion. So salt marshes and mangroves are oftentimes a focus of restoration efforts because they're so important to keeping these coastlines intact. Here's a picture of where you get salt groves and salt marshes and mangrove forests. And so you have herb or small plant dominated salt marshes found at mid to high latitudes, so all this black here. And then mangrove forests are found in tropical and subtropical environments where the minimum sea surface temperature is greater than 16 degrees Celsius. So when we look at a river and a stream, we talk about 3 different dimensions, and these all affect the characteristics of the stream, and those are the length of the stream. So you might look at how long it is from one segment to another. You might look at the width, so how far it is across here, or the vertical dimension, or the depth and how deep it is. And so each of these features can impact the water flow and the type of organisms that live there. So for example, in an area where the water becomes more narrow, water is going to move more quickly. In an area where it's wider, the water can slow down a little bit. You might get the water being a little warmer in those regions. And then the depth can determine, the deeper down you are, the more cool the water would tend to be. And so each of those different features, warmer water, colder water, different organisms, plants and animals like to live in different temperatures. The riparian zone is the transition area between the water and the land. And so it's just where the water and the land meet, and you get different vegetation right along that riparian region than you do as you go away from the river. So it tends to be, if you ever walk next to a stream, as you get down into that stream, especially if there's a lot of trees around there, it tends to get a little bit cooler. And it's just that moist, cool air right around the stream. And that leads to a different type of plants and animals that live there compared to more upland, where it can be drier as you move away from that water source. Here's some of the world's major rivers, just for your reference, a figure from your textbook. So you can just look at that if you are curious to see what some of the world's largest rivers are. Now, rivers and streams, if you look at, we talked about the different dimensions, the length, the width, and the vertical. And in the vertical water, we look at the surface. So if you were to look at different types of habitat, there's the surface water. There is the water column, which would be this whole depth of the water. And this dark blue is supposed to be the where the water is, and then the lighter blue, the bottom of the river. So you have your water column here, this depth, and then the benthic, or along the bottom, of the river. When you get to the sand or whatever type of sediment you have at the bottom, that's called the benthic. And so different organisms will live in the benthic area compared to in the open water column. The hyporheic zone is the transition between the surface water and the groundwater. So that's where water is moving from the river into the groundwater. And then the phreatic zone is the groundwater. And an aquifer is just a large area of groundwater. And we classify streams using the terms first order, second order, and third order. And a first order is a headwater stream. A second order is where 2 first order streams come together. So you're getting typically a little bit bigger of a stream. And then a third order is where the second order rivers or streams come together, and so on and so forth. So the larger the number, the more streams that have joined to form that river, and typically the more water that will be there, just because you have more water sources coming into that. So usually the bigger the number, the bigger the river or stream. Not always, but that's sort of the general trend. Here's another view of the different parts of a stream. So at the top of the picture here, we have this riffle here, and that's a shallow section of stream or river with a rapid current. and a surface that's broken by gravel, rubble, or boulders. So it tends to have that more riffled look to it, so a little more bumpy and choppy water. And then we have the wetted channel versus the active channel. The wetted channel is the part of the stream that has water for most of the year, and the active channel is where the water may go when there's a flood or when there's a little more water than usual. So it's where water may go, but it's not necessarily there all the time. Whereas a wetted channel is where the water is most of the time. The water channel is mentioned as this vertical depth here, and as you get down toward the bottom of your or your water column, as you get toward the bottom of that water column, right along the bottom of the river, we have the benthic zone, and the hyporheic zone, and the phreatic zone. So, and again, your where the water is leaching into the groundwater and where you get to the groundwater. And any region that organisms live in, whether it's in the water column or all the way down into the groundwater, any of those organisms living in that region would be considered aquatic organisms or organisms that live in the water. And water is constantly flowing from river channels into the groundwater, so just being pulled down by that force of gravity and so you constantly have that groundwater being replenished. Not always replenished as fast as we use it, but it is, if there's water above, it is going to be naturally tending to sink down into the groundwater. Next, let's look at lakes, another freshwater source. And here's a map of some of the world's largest lakes. Most of the world's fresh water resides in a few very large lakes. The Great Lakes of North America contain 20% of all fresh water in the world. So we've covered a lot of different structures in streams and oceans, and lakes have their own unique features and structures and their own unique terminology. So as we go through all these, instead of focusing on all the words and trying to memorize all the words or think about the words, because that can get overwhelming with all these different terms introduced, we try to focus more on what's going on in a picture or in whatever it is that we're talking about. So in a lake, for example, you tend to have your littoral zone, which is right along where it's shallow, right along the shoreline, and you get certain vegetation that grows along the shoreline of a lake. And then you have all this open water, and they call the open water the limnetic zone. And that's just all this open water. Now, in your open water, you have three different main layers, at least when the water's not frozen over. You have your epilimnion, where it's warmer, your metalimnion, where it starts to get colder, and then your hypolimnion, where it's all fairly constant, cooler temperature and darker. And so the main thing I would try to take away from this lake structure is if you think of swimming, if you've ever been swimming in a lake, you probably notice that if you float on the surface, it can feel very warm, but even if you put your body vertical in the water, your toes may be quite a bit colder than your upper body is. And so, and the deeper you go down, the colder it gets. And so what you're noticing is that epilimnion layer versus that metalimnion layer. Depending on how deep you go, maybe the hypolimnion, but getting colder as it gets deeper. Now that's true in the summertime. In the wintertime, lakes actually flip and they reverse where it's cold and where it's warm. So this, at least in an area where it freezes, will get frozen over and the ice will float to the top, and it creates a protective layer that allows the bottom water to all stay warmer and not get frozen over. So this top can get frozen over, and then the bottom will stay warmer. And so this metalimnion is still the transition between cold and warmer, but instead of having summer, warm on top, cold on bottom, winter, cold and frozen on top and warm on bottom. And this is a really important feature of lakes because instead of completely freezing through solid and everything dying out, the bottom of the water staying warmer and not freezing allows those things to live throughout the winter. And so this is just a picture showing the flipping of the water and how at different times of the year the water is warmer on top in the summer, colder on the bottom. And then it just shows you how really that's all this picture is saying. And so that's all you really need to take away from this is that in the winter you get the ice and it's going to be cold on top and a little warmer on the bottom. Not that it's going to be super warm, but warmer than the ice. Now, oxygen is a really important condition in a lake because it determines what types of organisms can live in the lake. And if we say a lake is oligotrophic, that means that it has low biological production, although it often has a lot of oxygen. And eutrophic means that it has high biological production. But because there's so many organisms in the water taking in a lot of oxygen, the water might get depleted of oxygen. Let's look at human influences of lakes next. Human populations can often have profound and usually a negative impact on lakes. Runoff from sources such as agriculture or human waste can have a lot of nutrients in that waste, and agriculture runoff is the same thing, a lot of nutrients that we put on those plants to grow, but if it gets in the water, all those nutrients can cause a bloom of something like algae and cause that to take over that water source and then use up all the oxygen and make it so things like fish can't survive there because there's not enough oxygen for them. Another thing that humans do is we move around species. So for example, boats going from one area to another can bring in non-native species like zebra mussels, and those can completely cover things like culverts and drainage pipes and all sorts of different things in lakes and cause lots of different problems, lakes and oceans. That's the end of the chapter 3 part of this lecture. And again, in chapter 3, we've looked at what the water cycle is, and then some of the main structural components of oceans, shallow marine waters, estuaries, salt marshes and mangrove forests, rivers and streams, and lakes. And next we will move on to chapter 4. In chapter 4, we cover a completely different topic. We move into population genetics and natural selection. So if you took biology, this may be something that you covered in your biology class. And the objectives for Chapter 4 are to explain the significance of Darwin's visit to the Galapagos Islands, list the 4 components of Darwin's theory of natural selection, explain what Gregor Mendel discovered about traits, differentiate between phenotype and genotype, explain what fitness is and how it relates to natural selection, compare and contrast stabilizing, directional, and disruptive selection and give an example of each, compare and contrast genetic drift and natural selection, explain how inbreeding corresponds to extinction rates, and give an example of an unintended consequence of genetic change in agriculture. We'll start off this topic with Charles Darwin, and in 1835, Charles Darwin was on a worldwide voyage and visited the Galapagos Islands and became convinced that various populations evolved from ancestral form. And so what he saw as he did his travels was species that would look similar, but as you move to a different area, you might still have a certain type of a bird, but you might get birds with varying characteristics. And he noticed that these animals would look similar, as if they'd evolved from a common ancestor, but in different regions as they had been separated, they evolved differences. And in 1838, after reading an essay by Thomas Malthus, he theorized that some individuals would have competitive advantage conferred by favorable characteristics. And what this means is that if a bunch of, say, birds living in an area were all eating seeds, certain birds might have beaks that are better at getting the type of seed in that area, and those birds with that better beak type would be the ones most likely to survive and pass on their traits to the next generation. So let's look at what exactly natural selection is. So Darwin's theory has these 4 components to it, and one is that organisms produce organisms that are like themselves. So you now know that this is because of genes, and that your genes get passed on from you to your offspring, making your offspring have traits like you. But he just knew that organisms have organisms that are like themselves. and that there's a chance variation between individuals, and that some of these variations are heritable. So within any population, you might get, for example, the deer in these pictures. There's a chance that some are going to be, let's say, darker brown, some lighter brown. Um, and the next step here is that more offspring are produced each generation than can survive. So within any species, they'll produce a certain number, and only a percentage of those will survive to maturity. And some individuals, because of physical or behavioral traits, have a better chance of surviving than others in the same population. So here in this picture, we have one that organisms produce more than are at birth and are actually going to survive through their whole lifetime and end up reproducing. And so within that group, there's variation, and some organisms, for whatever reason, are more likely to survive than others. So let's say that in the forest where these deer live, the darker brown ones maybe are just better camouflaged, and so the lighter brown ones are more likely to get eaten. Not that all of them get eaten, but just more likely that they don't blend in as well and they are eaten by predators. And so because of that fact, the light brown ones are more likely to be eaten. It's more likely that the dark brown ones will survive and reproduce, and therefore in each generation, you're going to get more of the darker deer and fewer of the lighter deer over time. And so that is what they call natural selection, and it's natural because it occurs without human interference, and selection, and that essentially nature is selecting the dark brown deer, deer that are better adapted to the environment. Some individuals in a population, because of their phenotypic characteristics, will have a higher chance of survival and produce more offspring. And natural selection works on phenotype, not genotype. So if you remember, the purple flower could be big A, or big A, little a. Natural selection doesn't see, an organism's not going to eat the plant based on whether it's got certain genes or not. It's going to eat the plant based on if it, likes that color. And so because of the color, some organisms will have a higher chance of survival and produce more offspring. And so that recessive gene, that white gene that's hiding there, might continue to get passed on, even though the plants that are pure white maybe are not as likely to survive. And fitness is a measure of an individual's contribution of offspring or genes to future generations. And essentially fitness is how many children you are able to produce, if you're looking in human terms, or how many offspring you can produce that survive to the next generation. And so you would be considered very fit if in terms of natural selection, in terms of scientific terms, if you have a lot of offspring. So fitness has nothing to do with how what we would think of as being fit and exercising and having a healthy body. Fitness in this sense is how many offspring you produce that survive. And natural selection can favor, disfavor, or conserve the genetic makeup of the population. So certain genes might be favored, certain genes might be, which means they'd be more likely to survive, certain genes might be, or traits might be disfavored, less likely to survive. So populations change, again, just like the deer, based on who is more likely to survive in that environment. Darwin helped us to understand how traits within a population can change over time, such as the deer population going from a mix of light brown and dark brown to darker brown over time due to the dark brown trait surviving better. Again, that's just an example, not really that dark brown survives better, but in that example, it shows us how that population changed over time. But he really didn't understand anything about genetics. They didn't know what DNA was at the time or genes. And Gregor Mendel helped us to understand more about how exactly traits are passed on. So he was an Augustinian monk. One thing that he studied in his garden was the garden pea. And he discovered from breeding peas of different colors and flowers of different colors that characteristics pass from parents to offspring in discrete packets called genes. And what he did was he would breed, for example, a yellow pea, where when you bred it, all he would get out of it was yellow peas. And then he would breed green peas that, he'd bred and bred and bred, and all he was getting was green. And he found that when he mixed a green pea plant, a green pea plant with a yellow pea plant, that all of that first generation would come out with yellow peas. And so you could assume from just that generation that the yellow sort of takes over and that they're just getting yellow. But then if you were to breed two from that generation, two yellow peas that were a product of these two, he found that always in the same ratio he'd get a ratio of 3/4 yellow and 1/4 green. And so he started realizing mathematically that he was always getting these certain percentages when he, whether he's looking at, peas or flowers, he would get this certain percentage of yellow and green every time he did the experiment. And so that helped him to realize that that there are what we call now these alleles, and that's basically a gene from one parent that's getting passed on. So for example, you might have a yellow allele. This parent has two alleles making it yellow. This parent has two alleles making it green. And so we'll get into a little more on how that works. But essentially, he was the first one to realize that genes are passed on and that you have these certain traits called genes that are. So what Mendel figured out is that organisms there's a difference in what we call their phenotype and their genotype, or what we see on the outside versus the genes that they have on the inside. So if you look just at the pea plants, you might see that pea plants are yellow, or they are green. Or you might see that a plant is short or tall. What you see by looking at it is the phenotype. The genes that something have is the genotype, and we abbreviate genes with letters for simplicity. So let's say that little a is a green gene and big A is a yellow gene. A plant can have two yellow genes and it will look yellow. A plant can also have a yellow and a green gene and it will still look yellow. The only way that a plant will be green is if it has two green genes. And the reason for this is the yellow gene is dominant, and that means if you have even one yellow gene, you're going to look yellow. The green genes are recessive, which means the only way the green gene will show up is if you have two copies of that green gene. So again, the genes that something has are the genotype, and the way it looks is the phenotype. We call each one of these genes an allele. And the two alleles that you have, or the two copies of the genes, determines what you're going to look like. Again, genotype, the genes that you have, phenotype is what you see on the outside, like yellow or green. So let's take a look at why Mendel found that when he crossed peas that were all only produced yellow offspring with peas that only produced green offspring, why he got all yellow peas in the first generation, and then when he crossed those two peas, why he got 75% yellow and 25% green. And the way to figure this out is through something called a Punnett square. If you've taken biology, you probably did this before. So what you do is you take the genes of one parent and you place them on this side. You take the genes of the other parent and place them on the other side. And so what Mendel, through all his research and figuring this out, he figured out that each parent has two copies of a genes for whatever trait you're looking at. So if you're looking at color, each pea has two genes that code for color. And in the yellow plant, we'll say that this yellow pea has two yellow genes, and we'll just call the yellow genes big A, big A. And then the green pea has two green genes, making it green. We'll call those little a, little a. And so what you do is you start taking the genes of one parent and you move them, you move the genes on the top down into these boxes, and you move the genes on the left across into each of these boxes. And so what you get here is you move the big A down, and then you move the little a across. And so you get big A, little a in this box. And you would do the same thing for each of these squares. And what that would give you is big A, little a in each box for this first generation. And what that means is big A, little a all came out yellow. And so what he was able to determine is that yellow is a dominant gene. So when you have a yellow gene and a green gene, all the plants are going to come out yellow. And we call that dominant because it's what shows up. The green gene is what we call recessive, and it's not showing up if there's a dominant gene with it. The only way that green will show up is if you have two green genes. Now let's take a look at what happens when we take two of these big A, little a plants and we cross them together. So if we take a big A, little a and a big A, little a, he found that he got 3/4 yellow and 1/4 green, and we can find out why with our Punnett square. So if you take your big A, little a from one parent here, a yellow and a green gene, and a yellow and a green gene, and you move these down and these across, then you get, in this box, you move the big A down, you move the big A across, and you get big A, big A. And big A, or two yellow genes means you get yellow. A yellow and a green gene also means you get yellow. So you get these three are yellow. And only this one pea plant that has two green genes comes out looking green. And so if you were to cross 100 different plants or get 100 different peas out of your test that you were doing, it would turn out that 75% of those, 75 out of the 100 would be yellow and 25 out of the 100 would be green. And that's because when you have a genotype or genes of two yellow genes or a yellow and a green gene, you're going to get a yellow phenotype. Remember, phenotype is what you see. And the only way you get green is if you have two copies of that recessive gene, so no dominant genes covering up the green. So if you get two green genes, then the green will show up. So that's a very quick review of the Punnett square. Your text goes into it a little more detail if you want to read up on that a little bit more, if that's still confusing. Now selection, as we talked about natural selection, like for example, the brown deer are more likely to survive. Selection can act in different ways. So under what they call stabilizing selection, that means that the extreme phenotypes don't survive as well. And the average phenotype, or what things look like, survives as well. So let's say that you were looking at body size, and some organisms have small body size, and some organisms have a large body size. Under stabilizing selection, organisms with a medium body size are the most likely to survive. So the very largest and the very smallest would not survive for whatever reason, and you'd end up with more and more of this medium-sized body over time. So over time, you kind of lose those ends, and you end up with more of the average, and that's called stabilizing selection. And here, stabilizing selection acts to impede changes in a population by acting against extreme phenotypes and favoring the average phenotypes. Now in directional selection, one end of the spectrum is favored over another. And so directional selection leads to changes in phenotypes by favoring an extreme phenotype over all the other phenotypes. So again, if you're looking at small, medium, and large body size, maybe in this example, large body size is more likely to survive and the medium and small body sizes die off. And so eventually over time, the population, you'll end up with more of this large body size. And our third type of selection is called disruptive selection, and that's when the extremes are favored but not the average. And so for some reason, the small organisms and the large organisms are able to survive, but those medium-sized organisms don't survive. And what that leads to is a curve where you end up with a lot of small and a lot of large, but not as many medium. So it creates what they call bimodal, which essentially just means it has two peaks here in the chart distribution. So this bimodal distribution favoring the extremes over the average. Here's an example of stabilizing selection for egg size among Ural owls. Um, so the Ural owl egg size differs among females and is influenced by the environment. So they found that egg size was highly heritable. So that means that it's, if whatever the genes are, if the mom has big eggs, then it's likely that her offsprings will have big eggs. And there's a lowered fitness in individuals that produce very small and very large eggs. So in this owl, if the owls have large eggs or small eggs, then those offspring are not as likely to survive. And the owls that had medium-sized eggs were much more likely for their offspring to survive. And again, fitness is how many of your offspring survive and reach maturity. And there is a lower hatchling success. The reason for this is that the very small and very large eggs are not as likely to hatch, and then fewer fledglings. So fewer of the owls, even if they did hatch, were likely to leave the nest and go out on their own. So the soapberry bug is another example that your text gives of a type of natural selection called directional selection. And this example, the soapberry bug feeds on these seeds called soapberries, and they use their beaks to pierce through the fruit walls to eat the seed that's inside. And they found a close relationship between the fruit radius, the distance from the outside of the fruit to the center of the fruit, and the beak length of the bird. And let's look at why that is on the next slide. So soapberry bugs eat the seeds of the plants that belong to the soapberry family, and they'll spend most of their life eating just the soapberries. And since that's the only thing they eat, the size of the soapberries, that's why it's so closely related to their beak length. And so what the soapberry bugs do, it's a little fuzzy here, sorry, but they have these long, slender beaks that go through the outside of the fruit and inside to the center, to this berry. And then they secrete enzymes into that berry to dissolve it and then to digest it. So they need a beak length that's long enough to get from the outside of the fruit and into the center to this seed. And bugs with a beak length that match the fruit they eat, so if they have a beak length that can get to the center of that fruit, long enough beak length, then they will have easier lives because any berry that they go to, they'll be able to get to the center and get to that seed and to eat. And bugs with beak lengths, as this cartoon says, that match the length of the fruits that they eat have easier lives. And when they have easier lives, they'll have lots of healthy babies. Their babies will also have beak lengths that resemble the length of the beaks of their parents. And so because of that, the bugs with short beak lengths will not be as likely to get the food that they need and not be as likely to survive, not be as likely to have baby bugs who also have shorter bug lengths or beak lengths. So after a few decades, most of the babies in that population are going to have a beak length that matches the distance from the outside of the seed or from the outside of the fruit to the seed. And so this is one example of, as I said, directional selection, and that bugs in one direction or the other, in this case with long beaks, are selected for in a population. So far we talked about change in a population due to natural selection or due to one trait being favored more than another. There's also a type of change that's due completely to chance, and one example of this we see through genetic drift, and that's where, let's say you have a population of red and blue butterflies, and the red butterflies just happen to be flying in this one area over here, and the blue butterflies are flying over here, and a flood comes through and just comes through this area right here, and the red butterflies just happen to get wiped out by the flood, and all that you're left with is blue butterflies. And so the population very quickly went from having a mix of red and blue to having almost all blue, and just by chance, not because the blue butterflies were camouflaged better or were better at surviving, but just by chance the red ones got eliminated. So genetic drift occurs when there's a change in the population that occurs by chance, such as red butterflies dying off randomly and blue butterflies surviving. This is different from natural selection, which occurs when one trait in a population makes the organisms more fit or more likely to survive. It's been found that populations that are very small are much more likely to be impacted by genetic drift. So let's say you look at your butterflies again, your red and blue butterflies, and if you had a very small population, it's much more likely that the red could just be wiped out by chance. If you have a really, really big population, it's less likely that all of one gene is going to get wiped out. So most likely if you had a huge population of red and blue butterflies, and a flood comes through, there's going to be some red ones somewhere that are going to survive. So the smaller the population, the less likely or the more likely it is that genetic drift will occur. And so the example of the spruce in your textbook is essentially saying the same thing, that they found that this certain type of spruce in the Sierra Madre range in New Mexico is now restricted just to the peaks of this area, so just to the top of the mountains, and so it's in a very small habitat that it can survive, and due to that they've seen lots of a loss of genetic diversity, and that's what they found, is that in species like the spruce, it's only on the top of mountains, the there's not a lot of genetic diversity left, just because there's not a very large range that it lives in, and it's likely that certain species get wiped out naturally through genetic drift. And so over time, they found a significant positive correlation between population size and genetic diversity. And for that reason, we found that it's really important, if you're trying to bring a species back, that you give it a large habitat area. The larger the habitat area, the better, and that you try to keep numbers of that population alive. And that's one problem they found with species that where they die off to really, really small numbers and become almost extinct, and we make them endangered species. There's not a lot of genetic diversity then left in that population. And so if something comes along like a disease, it's really likely that all of them will get wiped out. Let's look at genetic variation in an island population, because an island is sort of an isolated area that's not mixing with surrounding areas. And in general, genetic variation is lower in isolated and generally smaller island populations, just the same as the spruce that only lived on the top of the mountain range. Reduced genetic variation indicates a lower potential for a population to evolve. So when you have a small population and there's not a lot of variety in the genes, they're not going to change very much, because there's not, if you only have all blue butterflies and you don't have any red butterflies, then they can't change and vary from red to blue. If you just have blue, then that's what you have in that region. And so you don't see as much change in an isolated population. So these next couple studies in your text look at butterfly extinctions, and these studies show us why inbreeding is not a good thing in a population. And what they found in these studies is that these butterflies that they looked at, that populations with the highest levels of inbreeding had the highest probabilities of extinction. And the reason for this is that all of us have genes in us that are not so good. And say, for example, for certain deadly diseases or diseases that would make our life more difficult. And in most cases, these are recessive genes. They don't show up. And chances are whoever we breed with and have children with, or in any animal or plant population, whoever they breed with, those offspring are not going to get two copies of that gene, that both parents, they'll have each their own different bad genes, but they don't both have the same bad gene. So chances are those children will get a recessive copy of various genes that aren't so great, but they'll survive because they only have one copy of that gene. On the other hand, if you go and you have children with your brother or your cousin, it's very likely that since they're from the same family and they have similar genes, that they're going to have the same bad genes that you have. And so when you have children with your brother, your children, then it's likely that they'll get two copies of that bad recessive gene and then end up with diseases that make life more difficult for them or lethal for them. And so if you instinctively think that inbreeding is not a good thing, it really is not a good thing for that reason. Now, evolution in agriculture is a little bit different than evolution that just occurs naturally, because we are choosing in the foods traits that we like to make the food better for us. And so in nature, things changing, such as deer being more likely to survive if they're more camouflaged, that's called natural selection. There is also something called artificial selection, and this is where humans are choosing the traits that we like and breeding those species with those traits. So let's say, for example, that a long time ago we look at apple trees and we decide that we don't want tiny little apples, we like bigger apples. And we pick seeds from the biggest apple from that tree, and we grow a bunch of apple trees, and then in that next generation we again pick the biggest apples. Over time, you're selecting for that big apple gene. You're not changing the genes or going in and doing any kind of what we'll get into next, genetic engineering. You're just picking the ones that you like the best. And so over time, we're picking out the biggest apples, and then what we end up with are trees that produce all big apples because we've selected for that big apple gene. Now, that's called artificial selection. Genetic engineering is when we insert or delete different genes into a plant or animal, and we call that a genetically modified organism. So it might be taking a gene, let's say from a bacteria, and putting it into a plant, and let's say that that bacteria gene gives off a chemical that kills certain bugs, and so now that plant will produce a chemical that kills bugs with every generation because we insert that chemical gene into the plant, and that's what we call genetic engineering. Now, when we're growing plants, we tend to use various herbicides on the plants to kill off pests that are eating the plants in order to get a better crop. And what can happen is that if you were to spray a big group of plants that had bugs on them with a certain herbicide, most all of those bugs are going to die off, but there may be a few bugs that were by chance resistant to that herbicide that you used. And if those plants are those bugs are the only ones that survive out of, let's say, a huge field, and you spray it with this herbicide, and only the bugs that are resistant to it survive, then the next generation, all the offspring of those bugs are going to be resistant to that herbicide. And so what you can end up with is what they call unintended evolutionary consequences, that plants and animals can evolve resistance to chemicals used to control them very quickly. And as it says here, the resistance may be quick and widespread, and that's because you kill off all the ones that aren't resistant to it. Next generation, they're all resistant to it. And so, and that leads us to then needing to create different chemicals if we want to control the bugs that they're not resistant to. But resistance to things can occur very quickly. And that's the end of chapter 3 and 4 lecture. So again, in chapter 4, we looked at who Darwin was and how we learned from him about natural selection, who Mendel was, and how we learned from him that organisms have two different alleles or copies of a gene. And we talked about the Punnett square and how you figure out what genes the parents have and what genes the offspring will have. We talked about variation within populations, natural selection versus change due to chance, so natural selection versus genetic drift, and then how human-created changes in agriculture. And that is the end of our lecture. And we will be next week starting your biome presentations. If you have any questions as you get started on those, please let me know. Otherwise, have a good week, and I will be in touch with you again in week 3.